I want to see your hand in the air if you've ever had the following conversation with your accountant. Hey, you're really overstaffed, and at the same time, your team is telling you, dude, we're so slammed, you need to hire 3 people yesterday. Have you ever had that conversation? Have you ever felt like no matter how much you keep selling new work, you can't outsell your profitability problem? Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever grown your agency's revenue only to find yourself taking the same or less money out of it? Have you ever had this experience? My name is Marcel Petitpas. I'm apparently the GOAT of agency profitability, according to Rachel. And this is what I do. I help digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. It's the only thing I do besides sleeping, eating, going to the gym, and watching The Office, essentially, on an endless loop. And so what I want to share with you today is essentially a 4-set number, four numbers in a set that will allow you to see everything that you need to see to manage your profitability. And I'll explain the math behind why the strategies that were just talked about on the panel work. My goal is that by the end of this session, you will have no more questions about how to measure your profitability, and you'll be equipped to go and figure out exactly why you might be struggling to improve your profitability despite selling more work than ever, despite being busier than ever, and despite growing more than ever. Does that sound interesting? Yes or yes? Oh my goodness. This is going to be tough. The AV guy was like, hey, you're going to be behind the podium the whole time. I was like, can I go out into the audience? So let's try that again. Yes or yes? Yes. That's more like it. All right, so you're going to want to get your notepads out for this. I'm going to skip over the social proof. Here's the problem that you might be experiencing. Number 1, when it comes to measuring the agency, think about numbers. You might not really know what to do. There's a lot of different KPIs we could be measuring, but which ones should we be focused on? And maybe you've heard of a few of them. Utilization rate. Anyone ever heard that number? Okay, well, what exactly does that mean? What's somebody's capacity? What's included in that and what's not? Vacation time, sick time, paid time off, time they're working on clients, time they're not. What about the company foosball tournament, lunch breaks? There's a lot of nuance to these things. And exactly what is a billable hour? Does it matter if it was billed to the client or not? Or is it just the time that was worked on the project, regardless of how much we actually charge them for? What about internal time? What about working on the company website? Have you ever had discussions about this with your team and thought, I don't actually know what the answer is? Anyone ever had this experience? All right, so we hear these metrics. We hear all kinds of benchmarks. There's an agency down the street. They tell us to have an 85% utilization rate. You think, a lot higher than my utilization rate. Is there something wrong with how I'm doing it, or are we just calculating it differently? So there's a lot of mud in the water when it comes to the strategy and process for measuring these metrics. You're not alone. This is why I talk about it on stages, because when I was running my own agency, I didn't know what the hell was going on either. The second thing is you have messy processes and tools. Have you ever had the experience of trying to ask what seems like a really simple question? I want to take a moment. I've been speaking for 3 days, and I have the voice right now of a 14-year-old that is full swing and through puberty. So you're going to hear some voice cracks. All I ask is that you don't judge me. So messy tools and processes. Have you ever had the experience of saying, I want to answer a simple question, like, did we make money on this project? And did we spend as much time on it as we thought we would? And when you pull up your timesheets and you compare it to your estimate, the data doesn't look the same. On your estimate, it's something simple like this much design time, this much development time, and then you open up your time tracking tool and there's 300 discrete tasks. All of them are named differently, and you got to do a bunch of data cleanup to figure out how much of this is dev time, how much of it. Has anyone had that experience before? Right? So this makes what should be a simple process of answering these questions harder than it needs to be. And last but not least, because you don't have this information, you might have made really important decisions in the business based on your gut. Are we going to hire this person? Are we going to fire this person? Are we going to say yes to this client, even though it feels like we're really busy, but on the P&L, it looks like we really need the work? Anyone ever had this experience? You make the decision based on gut, and it makes this experience of running a firm more stressful than it needs to be. So my promise to you today is that I'm going to be running around the stage, going back and forth, and you might get vertigo from it, but we're going to talk about some clear metrics and benchmarks. We're going to boil it down to the simplest things that you can pay attention to today. We're going to give you a framework for repeatable outcomes so you have the same definitions on these metrics across the entire organization. And ideally, that will create alignment and predictability. So every time you scope new work, every time you go to answer these questions, you're getting a comparable measurement that you can look at over time and see trends and patterns in. Does that sound cool? Yes or yes? Yes. Let's try that again. Yes or yes? Yes. I'm a very demanding speaker, okay? So we're going to go through two primary things today. The first is we're going to talk about core financials. Not because I'm an accountant. I'm not an accountant. But because everyone in this room, I hope, is looking at financial statements at least once a year, probably more like monthly. Show of hands who's looking at financial statements in their agency. Wow, a lot of you are going to have problems with the IRS and the CRA. You don't file your taxes? Try again. How many of you are looking at financial statements? Yes? Okay, good. Not many of you are going to jail. So we're going to talk about what you're probably not seeing on your financial statements and a couple simple tweaks you can make to get more value out of this thing you're already doing, already spending time and money on, but actually getting the information that you need every time you get that touch point. Then we're going to talk about the three things almost no one is measuring properly, but that are really the only three ways to fundamentally improve your profitability as an agency. There's just three numbers. They're really simple. We're going to talk about exactly what they are, how to measure them, what the benchmarks are, all that stuff. Sound good? All right. Get your notepads out. We're going to start with core financials. So these are the things that you should be able to measure when you look at your profit and loss statement. The first one is revenue. If you can't currently see your revenue, someone's getting fired this afternoon, okay? If your accountant is messing this up, then they need to find a new career path, and you are going to be the one that's going to set them free to go and find that calling, okay? So that's pretty simple. How much money do we collect? But the thing that we need to also be able to isolate is AGI, which stands for Agency Gross Income. Some people call this net revenue. And essentially what this represents is after we have subtracted out the money that we collect on behalf of clients that does not belong to us, what's left over that we need to earn with our business? So what we need to do in order to isolate agency gross income is we need to subtract out something called pass-through expenses. Pass-through expenses. Does anybody know what a pass-through expense is? Show of hands. Pop quiz. Do I have any students in the room? Okay, we got a few people. Right, so these are things that we collect and then pass on to other vendors. By the way, my handwriting is also bad, but so is your doctor's. So that means I'm smart, okay? So pass-through expenses are things like media buy, Facebook ads, materials, white label partners. This is money that flows through you onto someone else. You're not responsible for the profitability of it. Someone else is. Doesn't matter how much time you spend on the project, that cost is staying the same. So we want to subtract that out so that we can understand what is our agency gross income? What do we need to earn with our time? That is what we benchmark our profitability against. Once we know that number, we then need to isolate what I call delivery margin. And really you can think of this as your gross margin. This is your gross margin, but I'm really tired of arguing with accountants over semantics, so I started calling it delivery margin. The problem here is that most of you, if you look at your P&L today, I'd be willing to bet that your pass-through expenses are being captured in the cost of goods sold section of the P&L. So what that means is the thing that your accountant is calling gross profit, it's actually your AGI. And what probably is also happening is all of your payroll is in one category, just lumped together in one big bucket. All of your software is lumped together in one big bucket. And the problem with that is you don't know your delivery margin. So delivery margin is going to answer the question, how much money is left over from AGI when the promise has been delivered to the client and we've incurred the cost of keeping that promise with the client? What is our fundamental profitability as a company once we sell and deliver the work that we do? So in order to measure that, we need to isolate what I call delivery costs. What is the cost of actually getting work done? Delivery cost. So generally what that means is we need to isolate, oh my goodness, that was a good one. We need to isolate the percentage of our payroll that is allocated to delivery. There's a lot of people on your team, 100% of their payroll is going here. These are your full-time designers, developers, copywriters. There's going to be a few people on the team, if you're smaller especially, wearing a few hats. As a founder, that's probably you. You might need to split their salary. 50% in delivery, maybe 25% in admin, 25% in sales, but you want to go through and allocate salary so you have an understanding of what is it costing you to do work for your clients so you can understand if you are fundamentally profitable or not. The other thing you're going to want to isolate is what I call shared delivery costs in here, which would be things like software licenses that are not attributable to a single client, but these are tools in your team's tool belt. Think Figma subscriptions, think Adobe Creative Cloud, think the types of ad management tools that you're using that aren't just for one client, they're for everybody, but these are kind of the tools that your team brings to the job. Anywhere from 4 to 6% of your agency gross income is typically going to end up with those tools. And the objective here is if you want to be profitable as an agency, you want to have a delivery margin that is above 50%. Okay? So this is why when Tiffany talks about this, when Courtney talks about her results-oriented compensation model, this is why it works. Because what we're doing is we're saying, we're going to have a 50% delivery margin no matter what. What she's doing is placing a firewall at the financial level. It's baked into the business. No matter how much time it takes my team to do this work, as long as we're charging this amount and paying out this much, we have a 50% delivery margin. It's a beautiful idea, really. But most of us are not installing this model. So what we're going to spend most of our time today on is how do we achieve this delivery margin? I'm willing to bet that if most of you went and measured this on your P&L today, it's not going to be at that level. So why does our delivery margin need to be at 50%? Well, because we need to run the business afterwards. And we got to spend money on overhead. So we got lawyers, we got accountants, we got maybe an office to pay for. We have co-working spaces. We have to pay for licenses and all these other things. We have to pay for an admin assistant. Most of our salary as a founder is probably going here. And so generally, we're going to spend anywhere from 20 to 30% of our agency gross income on overhead. So what that means is if we have a 50% delivery margin, anybody good at math, how much profit should we have left over? Anywhere from 20 to 30% or more, right? Who agrees that that's a reasonable target? Okay, we put our livelihood on the line to eke out 20 or 30% of all the value we create in this enterprise. I think that's reasonable. So if we know we're going to be spending anywhere from 20 to 30% of our money on creating an environment for our business and the team, then we've got to hit that 50% or more on delivery margin. Is everyone tracking so far? Yes or yes? Okay, so let's go through a quick example of how that plays out in practice. So in this example, we have an agency that did $1.5 million in revenue. They had $500,000 in pass-through costs. So maybe they're offering a service, but they white label that every time. So $500,000 comes out. Their business is actually doing $1 million in AGI. That's the real size of this business. They spent $400,000 on delivery costs. Most of that's payroll. That means they have a delivery profit of $600,000 or a delivery margin of 60%. So far, so good. Yeah, let's give them a round of applause for the fictional agency. Great job. So from there, we got to pay for overhead. They spent $140,000 on sales and marketing. That would include some salary allocations. Maybe they have a part-time or a full-time salesperson. They spent $100,000 on administration and another $55K on facilities. In total, 29.5% went to overhead. They had an EBITDA of 30.5%. Let's give them another round of applause for being excellent. Wow. Running an agency is so much easier when it's completely fictional. All right. So the thing I want to talk about is the biggest problem that we see at Parakeeto. We audit several agencies every month. We go in, we take a fine-tooth comb through their profit and loss statement. Almost none of them can see their delivery margin. And when they do, it's rarely a very fun conversation. Most agencies are focused on overhead spending when they find us. And the reason for this is because when they look at their P&L, they can see this, they can maybe see this, and then they can see this. And so all they know is we have money coming in, we have very little coming out. What is happening in between that's causing that? And the first place that your mind goes as an operator is, well, I just need to cut costs. So we start looking to overhead. Let's switch from the $400 version of the software to the $200 version. Let's try to find a cheaper lawyer. Let's try to find a cheaper accountant. But there's not that much juice in the squeeze. There's maybe 10% EBITDA in overhead. The fundamental issue is generally that delivery margin is not strong enough. And what's interesting is as your delivery margin goes up, you can spend more money on overhead, You can have a fancy office, you can buy a Porsche for the company car, you can take your team on nice offsites and still have a higher profit margin. So I'm here to talk about the elephant in the room, which is how do we become more fundamentally profitable and increase our delivery margin? Is anyone interested in learning about that? Yes or yes? Okay, lovely. Because I could just give you the time back, but I'm not going to do that now. So there are only 3 ways to improve your delivery margin. First, let's talk about the formula. The formula for delivery margin is the following. Agency gross income, AGI, minus delivery cost, divided by AGI. Okay? So agency gross income is green because it's income. Delivery cost is red because it's not. Oh, I'm hanging on by a thread. Are you hearing this? Okay, so for example, we do $1 million in AGI, we spend $400K, divided by $1 million, we had a 60% delivery margin, okay? So there are 3 ways to improve this. How many?
3.
How many? 3 ways to improve it, okay? The first one is related to cost. I'll start with the most boring one. Average cost per hour, ACPH, okay? Average cost per hour is the precursor to delivery costs. What we're paying attention to on average cost per hour is for every hour that my team spends doing work, on average, what does it cost me? So the more a person gets paid, the higher their average hourly cost per hour. Make sense? Pretty simple. So the formula for this is very simple. Okay, we take somebody's total payroll, or we take a team's total payroll, or a time period's total payroll, or a project's total cost, and we divide it by hours, or in this case, we could call this capacity. Okay? So here's an example of how we would run that formula. We have a strategist, they get paid $120,000. Their average cost per hour is $57.69. And we have an intern that gets paid a lot less than that. Their average cost per hour is $26.44. Now, there's some project managers in the room having an aneurysm right now because they're like, wait a second, 2,080 hours, that's 52 times 40, right? They're like, aren't you going to strip out paid time off and holidays? And no, we're not going to do that for 2 reasons. Number 1, this is a complexity trap. If we factor those things into this metric, we now have to carry that complexity through our entire reporting system, and we add a ton of variables that are next to impossible to track. What we do instead is we simply bake that inefficiency into our delivery margin target. So when we set our target margin at the project level and at the agency level, we measure that in relation to how much loss we're going to experience with this paid time off, the sick time, the holidays, and our utilization. And now we no longer have to spend 10 times as much energy trying to track this metric across, and it becomes horizontally consistent. This is also incredibly important. We no longer have a set of variables that changes this value through time, so we can compare 2 time periods to each other and actually get a read on if we fundamentally improved or not, because we're removing externalities. That's a little bit cerebral, but just trust me on this. I've been doing this for 5 years. I've helped hundreds of agencies. The complicated, more precise thing here is actually not the right answer. It's okay. Sometimes it can be simple, okay? So average cost per hour is the first lever. So the reason that this is a precursor is because, of course, as we decrease our average cost per hour, and the way that we typically do that is by getting less expensive talent to do more of the work on projects. The way we do that is simple, but not easy. You have better processes. Oh, I'm driving on the edge of a cliff here. You have better processes. You decrease the level of judgment that's required, and typically by decreasing judgment required to do the work, you decrease the level of experience required, and that typically correlates to cost. So simple, not easy, and maybe not that fun. Maybe we like having really intelligent, expensive people on our team, and that's a luxury that we want to be able to afford. So let's talk about that, how to move the other lever, which is getting paid more AGI for the exact same costs that we have today. There's 2 ways to improve agency gross income. The first one is average billable rate, ABR. Okay, so this is related to, of course, increasing AGI. ABR is the counterbalance to average cost per hour. What it measures is for every hour that we spend doing stuff for clients, how much money do we make? And this is not to be confused with your hourly rate. It doesn't matter if you bill by the hour, if you bill on value, if you have retainers, whatever flavor of retainer you have, it's hourly based, it's flat rate, we have rollover, we have credits, sometimes we roll them over, sometimes we don't. I digress. It doesn't matter how you bill, you get paid a certain amount of money and it takes you a certain amount of time to get it done. Our average billable rate measures, on average, for every hour that we spent, how much money got earned for the business. Okay? So the formula for this is, again, dead simple. We look at what was our agency gross income, AGI, and we divide that by hours. And the term I'm going to use here is delivery hours. We're going to jump down another really quick rabbit hole here, assuming that I have the time for it. Yeah, I got some time. Okay. So why do I call it a delivery hour? You might be thinking, we call that a billable hour in our agency. And that might very well be the same thing. But if you have any instances where you bill by the hour, it's actually probably not the same thing. A delivery hour measures how much time it took us to do the project. A billable hour measures how many hours we billed to the client. Sometimes those are a little different. Yeah? Because we f***ed up, the client was a little pissed off, we're not going to bill them extra for that thing. So while we had 100 billable hours, we actually had 120 delivery hours. We need to measure our average billable rate based on how long it actually took to do the work. So sometimes that separation is important. So this is very simple. Again, simplicity is important because it makes these metrics scalable, horizontally consistent, and inexpensive. And that's really important because when we're going from not really measuring anything to trying to measure something, we want to keep it simple. So here's an example of how we could run a project-based ABR report and start to get some insight into what's driving higher or lower average billable rate. So 10 times out of 10, I ask an agency if they're not seeing this information, hey, what was your most profitable client? They immediately say, well, the website, obviously. They paid us way more money than the other projects, but this was actually the least profitable project. Based on the amount of time it took them to do it, they earned an average of $100 per hour. Whereas this dark horse here, the funnel build, they had a lot of pass-through. They gave most of their money away to a partner, but it only took them 50 hours to manage the work. Presumably here, they're just doing account management, maybe a little strategy. Someone else is doing the heavy lift. They earn $200 per hour. Let's think about this for a second. If you have a finite amount of hours in a month to direct towards client work, do the math. Do you want to do $100 per hour or $200 per hour? You can effectively, I know this sounds too simple to be real, but this is how the math works. You can double the amount of revenue that your team handles by focusing on work that is more efficient at earning you revenue. So that's average billable rate. This is a big insight. Imagine the conversation you have with your team around this. Hey, what happened with the website build? Did it take longer than we expected? Did we not scope it properly? Is there something about our process that's slowing things down? Oh, the handoff from design to dev is clunky and there's a lot of back and forth there. Okay, let's talk about that. How can we make that easier? Also, the funnel build, great job. We knocked it out of the park, clients thrilled, we made great money. Is there anything about a funnel build that we can apply to other projects to make them more efficient? What are we doing differently here? What if we sold more funnel builds? Seems like that would be a good idea. So there's a lot of insight that we can get from measuring average billable rate. Here's a little hack for you, a little trick. This is the same formula as delivery margin, but we've swapped out our delivery cost with average cost per hour, and we've swapped out our AGI with ABR. So we can use average billable rate and average cost per hour as a proxy for delivery margin in more precise increments. So we could assume the delivery margin on a project, on a client, on a certain time period by swapping these two metrics into that calculation. It's a nice little cheap, effective proxy that requires no financial data whatsoever. You don't have to wait for your bookkeeper, wait for your accountant, wait for your invoices. You can model this very, very quickly. The thing that I love about these two metrics, okay, average cost per hour, average billable rate, is they scale horizontally and vertically perfectly. Because they're so simple, I can compare these from 6 months ago to today, and because we've isolated the variables, the comparison is meaningful. And we can also use this to look at any time period, a 6-month period, a 6-week period, a 6-day period, and we can look at it for a single client, a single project, a group of clients, a group of projects. So we can use this to slice and dice the business however we want, so long as we have the two inputs required. In this case, for average billable rate, if we know how much AGI and how many hours we took, we can measure it. So this is a really inexpensive way to start to get a lot of insight into what's driving profitability. Are we all tracking so far? Yes or yes? Yeah. Am I losing? Okay, I'm not losing you yet. Okay, that's good. My voice is hanging on. We're on the home stretch. We have one last profitability lever. Anyone want to guess what it is? Crickets. You're hanging on by a thread. You're on the edge of your seats. What is the Ryan Reynolds of agency profitability going to say next? It's utilization. Our old friend, or as I like to call it, the dark saber. If you're a Star Wars nerd, the dark saber of agency metrics. It has great power, but it comes with great responsibility. This has been used wrong a lot. It might be being used wrong in your agency today. The way we measure utilization is very simple. We're going to look at delivery hours. Again, for any time period, any group of employees, the scales horizontally and vertically, divided by capacity. And just like before, the answer to the questions I asked earlier, delivery hours only cares about, was this time spent working for clients? And capacity is not adjusted for vacation time, paid time off, sick time, holidays, anything like that. Now, there's a much more obvious reason why we wouldn't do that here. If we did adjust for that, then the definition of this metric becomes the more time off my team takes, the more profitable we become. Is that true? It's the opposite of true. Therefore, we cannot measure it this way. Now, I want to talk really quickly about why that happens a lot. It happens a lot because we make the mistake of exposing this metric to our team and then holding them accountable to it. And as soon as we do that, then all of a sudden, somebody is going to get slapped on the wrist for taking time off, which they should be doing. And so we change the definition of capacity to appease sentiment, even though it is incorrect mathematically based on this equation. And we do the same thing with a billable hour. Well, you asked me to work on the company website, and now my utilization is 50, and I'm embarrassed in front of my peers in this meeting where we're talking about utilization, which is not a good idea in the first place. So we changed the definition of a billable hour to now mean something that's productive, even though, again, if we all started spending more time on the company website, are we being more profitable? No. So there are other ways to look at utilization that project managers might use to measure something that's different than profitability. Are we efficiently utilizing our available capacity? It's a different question, but just be militant. We have to keep this metric in this format. So very, very simple, which again is useful because it's less expensive. It's delivery hours over capacity. Here's an example of how we would measure this. We have 2 full-time employees. They had 160 hours of capacity in this time period, presumably a month. And we had Rochelle, who was working part-time. This is how we would measure their utilization. And in aggregate, we ended up at 67.5%. I'm about to show you benchmarks. They're going to be lower than the benchmarks you've heard from other agencies. And the reason for that is most agencies are adjusting capacity and adjusting delivery hours. And it's the reason that benchmarking this number is really, really hard to do. Okay? So what should our targets be as an organization? I'll get into this a little bit later, but really there isn't a target. But if you're trying to do what everyone else is doing, for pure producers, 75% plus is the target. So we're talking 28 to maybe on the high end, 36, 38 hours. The thing that's going to modulate utilization rates is client dilution. If I'm a software developer, I'm working on one client for an 8-month project, and I barely have to go to any internal meetings because I know my marching orders, I might be 95% utilized and not feel burnt out at all. Whereas if I'm an account manager and I have 50 accounts to oversee, my utilization might be trash and I feel totally burnt out. Firstly, because it's impossible for me to track my time. My day is flying by in 5-minute increments, but also because the client dilution is such that most of my time can't be attributed to a single client. So for delivery managers, this is account managers, project managers, this might be your head of design, head of something else. They're going to spend more of their time overseeing that team. Anything above 0 really is a bonus, but typically we're expecting less billable time from them. And anyone else in the agency, your salesperson, your admin person, they're probably going to be 0. And we need to leave them in this calculation as well so we can reflect the cost of that when we measure it. Agency-wide on a weekly basis, if you want to charge the same thing as everyone else and have a good chance at being profitable, you probably should be capable of hitting a 65% utilization or higher. And on an annual basis, you're going to want to subtract anywhere from 10 to 15% from that target to account for time off and holidays and sick time and so on. So that gives you kind of a baseline of 50%. So when you model your agency, and I'll tell you how to do that in a moment, if you can't get to 50%, this does not mean that you cannot be profitable. It just means you got to pay for it somehow. What are the other 2 levers that you could pull to make up for low utilization? Does anybody remember? You could lower your average cost per hour, right? Pay people less money. That's not very fun. Probably not going to go over well. Or you can increase your average billable rate. Spend less time doing the same stuff or charge more money for the same stuff. Yeah? There's an infinite combination of these metrics that can get us to where we want to go. And so I want to show you a very simple example on how these things come together, because these are all very abstract, but let's talk about a real example here. Let's imagine that fictional agency from before, we're all very big fans, they do great work, okay? They have 10,000 hours of capacity. That's about 5 full-time employees in a year. Their utilization is 50%. They average $100 per hour. This agency can earn $500,000 of AGI in a year. In example 2, they do some optimization. They increase their utilization to 60%. They keep their average billable rate where it is. They can now earn $600,000. With the same team, same cost structure, same salary, they're $100,000 more efficient. In the last example, they keep their utilization at 60% and they make a couple pricing tweaks. They get a little more efficient. They use some tech partners to drive down their, see what I did there? Drive down their time for delivery. Now they can make $750,000 with the same team. They've gone from $500,000 to $750,000. Let's imagine in this scenario that it cost them $300K for this delivery team. Their delivery margin just went from 40 to 50 to 60%. And if we imagine that they had 30% of their AGI at this level going towards overhead, that number has decreased relatively speaking. What was 30% of $500,000 is in the low 20s in terms of 750. So their increase to profitability is not just 20%, it's more than that. Or they have a bigger budget for overhead. So this is the power of focusing on even just these 2 metrics and the impact they can have. Right? We talk about these little incremental improvements to ABR, to utilization, but the impact on your agency, and this is at a small scale, many of you are doing orders of magnitude more than this. You have teams of 20, 30, 40, 50 people. This could be representing millions of dollars in lost opportunity, and all you got to be paying attention to is a couple of simple levers. So, I have some free stuff for you. We have the Agency Profitability Toolkit here. Inside the toolkit, there are videos, templates, cheat sheets, and spreadsheets that will walk you through everything that I just walked you through, but in more detail, and allow you to start calculating these things for yourself, figuring out what is my utilization target? How does it change as I change my team composition? How does my business change as I tweak these metrics? So if you want to get free access to that and then get spammed by a bunch of emails from me and remarketing ads, and you can just unsubscribe from that stuff, then scan the QR code or head to parakeeto.com/toolkit and get access to that absolutely free. I'll be around for the after party and so on and so forth. Thank you very much for having me, and have a great day.